We're going to talk about some Christian philosophy. So this part of the course will feel a little bit different than what we've been doing in the past. In the past, we've been talking about the beliefs, history, and practices of traditions. We're going to focus on some of the Christian philosophy that we get in this tradition. We're going to look specifically at an argument for the existence of God from a Christian saint, Saint Anselm, and the response to that argument from a French monk named Ganillo. This is known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. Ontological because it centers on the nature or the essence of what God is. The ontology of something is the reality, the essence, the nature of it. That's why it's an ontological argument. St. Anselm lived in the 11th and 12th century. He was an Italian monk. There are his birth and death dates, and here's a painting of what Anselm might have looked like. The argument style of Anselm is a little bit different than the style of most arguments. It's not direct, it's indirect, and that's why it's called an indirect proof. Or if you want to use an older Latin phrase, it's a reductio ad absurdum. It is a reduction to absurdity. These sorts of arguments work like this. They start with an assumption that they ultimately want to reject. So Anselm wants to prove God exists. So the assumption that he ultimately wants to reject is the assumption that God does not exist. He's going to start with that assumption that God does not exist, and then try to show that such an assumption, that assumption doesn't make sense, and thus we have to throw it out. And if we throw out the idea that God doesn't exist, then that means that God does exist. So it's an indirect method. Instead of just directly proving that God exists, Anselm's going to indirectly do it by showing that the idea that God doesn't exist doesn't make any sense. So in short, Anselm's move is the following. He argues that a world without God doesn't make sense. Thus, God has to exist. So I'll repeat that again. A world without God doesn't make sense. Thus, God has to exist. So the crux of this argument will be to show precisely why a world without God is nonsensical. And if he can do that, then he is successful. So let's go through these bullet points. Any premise or assumption that leads to a contradiction must be false. So Anselm's going to start with the premise or assumption that God doesn't exist. And if you can show that that idea leads to a contradiction, right? A contradiction is something that doesn't make sense. It's something and its opposite, right? So take the idea that all bachelors are married. That premise or assumption leads to a contradiction, because if we assume that that's true, if for the sake of argument we presume that all bachelors are married, this leads to a contradiction. If that's true, then we know two other things are true that are inconsistent, that are contradictory. If all bachelors are married, then on the one hand we know that all bachelors are married, but we also know just from another source, just from the definition of bachelors, that a bachelor by definition is unmarried. So from the concept of bachelor, we know that all bachelors are unmarried, but here we have the opposite. And so that assumption would be thrown out. Anselm attempts to show that the assumption God does not exist leads to a contradiction. And if God does not exist is false, then we've arrived at the Christian belief that God must exist. So here is the argument, and if you read it, it is in older English because it's been translated from the French of Anselm's time. But essentially what's going on here is that Anselm starts with a quality of God that even atheists will embrace. They will say, well, even conceptually, yes. And that is this idea that God is the greatest conceivable being. Or in other words, God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. So I'm actually going to revise what you see here highlighted. I'm not even going to read it because it's, I think, overly complicated for the kind of class that we're doing. And we're going to investigate this rephrased argument. Okay. So let's go through the argument. Premise 1. It's impossible to think of something greater than God. God's the greatest conceivable being. Now we are going to assume that God doesn't exist. So remember, the basic move of the argument is that in a world without, a world without God doesn't make sense. So first, start with that in your imagination. I want you to pretend that there is no God. Remember, when I say world, I mean all that exists. I don't just mean the earth. I mean anything that exists. So if you are a believer in God, then just use your imagination. Just for the sake of argument, pretend that that belief is mistaken. Just imagine that there is no God. And if you are an atheist, someone who doesn't believe in God, then this will be easy to imagine because this is just the world as it seems to you. So what would this world be like? A world without God. Well, St. Anselm would argue that in this world, someone could have an epiphany. Someone could realize that they can think of something greater than God. In a world where God doesn't exist in reality, then you can think of something greater than God. The second part of this fourth premise. And the reason we can do this is because in a world without God, God is just an idea. God is like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny in this world without God. We have the idea of God, we have the concept, but that idea or concept does not connect to anything in the world, just like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or the Easter Bunny. Every adult can conceptualize, can imagine the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus, but we know that that idea, that concept doesn't link or connect, doesn't express anything, any real object external to our minds. God's just an idea, the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy is just an idea in our heads that doesn't connect with any external real object. And so someone might have an epiphany. If God is just an idea, then I can think of something greater than the idea of God, the reality of God. Because certainly to exist as an object in the world is better than merely existing as an idea. For instance, if Santa Claus were real, that would be much better than if Santa Claus were just an idea. Or an even better example, if you had to choose between, I will give you the idea of a giant stack of cash worth millions of dollars, or the actual stack of cash, which will you choose? Which is greater? Presumably existing in reality is better, and that's what the third premise is saying. That if something doesn't exist in reality, it's just an idea. It just, in other words, it exists only in the understanding. So that phrase, exists only in the understanding, another way of saying that is God is just an idea. So let's run through this again. We are imagining a world without God. So God is like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. And someone in that world realizes that they can imagine something greater than God the idea, God the reality. Right? It's possible to think of something greater than God. Forget that little R and all those R's after God for the moment. But by definition, this is impossible. So there's a contradiction between 1 and 5. By definition, we know it's impossible to think of something greater than God, but our assumption that God doesn't exist entails 5, that you can think of something greater than 5. So our assumption, which was 2, leads to a contradiction. The contradiction is between 1 and 5. You have some statement and its opposite. So our assumption 2 must be false. Well, it's false that God doesn't exist, then God does exist. So that's Anselm's argument for the existence of God. Now there are several problems with this. One of the problems is that Anselm might be guilty of a fallacy known as equivocation. One equivocates when they inconsistently use a word or term or phrase. So for instance, if I argued that since God is love and love is blind, therefore God is blind. That sounds funny, but that argument doesn't really work because I've inconsistently used words in that argument. So I said God is love, but the love of that statement is not really the same as love is blind. So I've equivocated on the word love, at least in that argument. There might be other problems with it. A lot of humor is based on equivocation. Groucho Marx, a famous comedian, once said that time flies like an arrow. You know, time flies, it goes really fast. And then he followed that up with fruit flies like a banana. So the joke is that is based on the ambiguity, the equivocation of the word flies. Flies, do we mean travels or passes, or do we mean flies the insect? So here we got the same thing. There might be equivocation on the word God. Do we mean God the reality or God the idea? And if we're consistent with that meaning of the word God, then the argument will fall apart. So here I put little r's next to God, and we'll see that the argument doesn't work anymore. Let's go through it. It's impossible to think of something greater than God, the reality. Yeah, that sounds right. So if there were this God and reality really existed, yeah, you can't think of anything greater than that. Even an atheist would say, yeah, if there is this being in reality, yeah, by definition, that's greatest being. Okay, so now we assume that God doesn't exist. So we assume this God in reality doesn't exist. So now we're talking about God, the idea. If God in reality does not exist, then God in reality only exists in the understanding. So God's just an idea. All right. So if God, the reality, only exists in the understanding and not in reality, then it's possible to think of something greater than God, the reality. So that premise is just false. Just because God exists just as an idea in this thought experiment, that doesn't mean that you can think of something greater than God, the reality. So 4 would be false. And that would mean the argument's falling apart. The other problem with this argument that the French monk of the 11th century, Ganillo, noted is that Anselm must employ some kind of faulty reasoning because we could use that reasoning to prove the existence of all sorts of its absurd things like perfect islands. So if you go back to the argument and you replace perfect being which God is, with perfect island, then you'd be able to prove the existence of a perfect island. It's impossible to think of an island greater than the perfect island. Let's call it Risa. Assume that Risa doesn't exist. If Risa doesn't exist, then Risa only exists in the understanding and not in reality. If Risa only exists in the understanding and not in reality, then you can think of something greater than Risa. It is possible to think of something greater than Risa. That follows from 2 through 4. Well, that's a contradiction. 1 and 5 are a contradiction. So our assumption that led to the contradiction, which is 2, must be false. So now we prove the existence of the perfect island. So you can take the format, you can take the structure of Anselm's original argument and use it to prove the existence of the perfect whatever, the perfect fill-in-the-blank. Instead of Ganillo's perfect island, you could prove the existence of the perfect pair of shoes, or the perfect linebacker for the 49ers or the Raiders, or the perfect three-point shooter for the Warriors, or the perfect home, or the perfect surfboard, or the perfect guitar or piano. And now our world is getting pretty crowded with all these perfect things. Do all these perfect things exist? Probably not. So Ganillo says, I can't put my finger on exactly what's wrong with this argument, but I know there's something wrong because we could use it to prove the existence of all these absurd things. Yeah, so it looks like the problem is that Anselm equivocates. He uses one word or phrase in 2 different ways. He's not consistent with the meaning. Just like with love here, there's not a consistency with love. The first statement, God is love, that means kind of unconditional love. And the second statement, love is romantic love. And just when both those statements are really shorthands, when you really express in a longer, more precise way what those statements mean, then the syllogism falls apart. God is love, you're saying God, one of God's qualities is being wholly good or all-loving, or God is unconditionally forgiving. And the second statement, when you say love is blind, that means that you don't get to choose who you fall in love with, right? You might fall in love with someone who's really bad for you in a lot of ways, but that's just, feelings just come up, and that's just the way it is. It doesn't follow that God is blind. So let's run through this one more time. When we disambiguate God, and we fill in either we mean God the reality, or God R, or God I, God the idea, in any sensible way, the argument runs into problems. So we looked at one way to do this in the prior slide, and here's another way to do it. It's impossible to think of something greater than God the reality. That seems right. Now let's assume this God doesn't exist. Okay. So if we assume that God doesn't exist, then God exists as just an idea. So if we assume that God doesn't exist, God the reality doesn't exist, then God the idea exists only in the understanding. It's not clear if that is true, but let's, for the sake of argument, let's say yes. If God the idea exists in only the understanding, not reality, then it's possible to think of something greater than God the reality. Thus, it's impossible to think of something greater than God the reality. So this argument doesn't work because 4 is false. Just because God exists as an idea, that doesn't mean that you can think of something greater than God R. And really, no matter how we put in God R, God I, as long as it's sensible, the argument won't work, either because at least one of the premises will be false, or the inference will no longer be good. So that was an argument from the Christian tradition for the existence of God. Now we'll look at an argument against the existence of God, known as the problem of evil. So there are different ways to articulate this argument. Here's the top one. God and evil cannot coexist. Evil exists, therefore God doesn't exist. Or, if God exists, the world would be the best of all possible worlds, but this isn't the best of all possible worlds, so God doesn't exist. Well, what do we mean by evil? Evil is a very old, loaded term. We can focus on a particular evil, that of suffering, especially human suffering, especially any suffering that it seems pointless or needless, like the suffering of innocence, especially if there were children that suffered. There are two kinds of suffering or evil. Moral evil, the suffering or evil that results from human free will. Natural evil, the evil or suffering that doesn't result from free will, i.e. the suffering that results from nature. What are examples of these two kinds of evil? Well, natural disasters, they aren't evil in of themselves, they result in suffering, and that's the evil. So after all of these natural disasters, we've got a death toll. Hurricane Katrina led to the death of over 1,800 Americans, but that's nothing compared to the death toll of the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti from a few years ago and the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, which nearly killed 250,000 people. And think about the suffering of creatures that lived before us, say the dinosaurs, all that suffering from their extinction. Disease, not disease itself, but the suffering and death that results from disease can be thought of natural evil. Swine flu nearly killed 4,000 people. We've lost over 25 million from the AIDS epidemic. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death, resulted in the death of over 100 million people, which was a large percentage of Europe's population at the time. Smallpox is the most deadliest disease in history. Over 300 million people have died from smallpox. Moral evil. So this is not the evil that we can this is the evil that we can blame people for. It's the evil, the suffering that results from human free will. So these first examples are books and or movies where there was a story of some atrocity that was committed to an innocent person. A minor that was abused psychologically, sexually, by someone close or by a stranger, kidnapped, tortured, raped, and eventually murdered in some cases. These are some of the worst things that we can do to each other. 9/11, 3,000 about was the death toll. The genocide in Sudan, in Darfur, 200,000 people. 500,000 people died in the genocide at Rwanda. Stalin, 2.5 million people died at the hands of Stalin. The Crusades led to the death of 5 million. The colonization of Americas, including the death of millions of American Indians or Native Americans. Slavery killed at least 15 million people. 15 million people also died in World War I, and 50 million, if you include the Holocaust, in World War II. And what's around the corner with the potential for global warming? Will we all go extinct, or a nuclear holocaust? So the question is, why would God allow either moral or natural evil in the world? If God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, which literally billions of people believe, then why doesn't God stop or prevent or intervene to prevent this suffering? It doesn't seem like the amount of suffering we have in this world, the amount of pointless suffering, is consistent with a being that has all those three attributes. Think about it. If God is omniscient, that means God's all-knowing. That means God knows about the suffering. If God is omnipotent, that means God is all-powerful. That means God has the power to do something about it. And if God is omnibenevolent, that means that God is wholly good or all good, and God should have the motive to do something about that. You put all those three together, then there shouldn't be this needless evil, but they do seem to exist in these two forms. So what Christian philosophers and just philosophers in general are looking for is a solution to the problem of evil that take the form of theodicies. A theodicy is a morally sufficient reason for why God allows evil. So it's a solution to the problem. One of the more common ones is the free will theodicy. God's off the hook for evil. It's not our fault. It's our fault, not God's. So God gave us this gift, the gift of free will, if there is a God, and God isn't to blame for murder and rape and genocide and kidnapping and torture and war. That's a result of our free will. And if God were to intervene, that would infringe upon our free will, which God can't do because that's a gift from God. So notice reply C, that this does not get God off the hook for natural evil. Even if we're to blame for wars and genocide and torture and rape and kidnapping and stabbings and all those things I mentioned and riots, God would still seem to be on the hook for the suffering from disease and natural disasters. Another idea is free will really worth it? Free will's great, but what about a world without free will? Yeah, from our perspective, that sounds no good. We'd be more like automatons or robots. But from a more objective perspective, maybe the world would be better off. From the perspective of trees and plants and rivers, if they have such a perspective. And probably the best reply to the free will theodicy beside reply C is reply B here. Since God has perfect foreknowledge, is omniscient about what we're going to do with our free will, why not just not allow the creation of people who are going to do really nasty things with their free will? So in other words, don't allow the Hitlers and Stalins and murderers to be born in the first place. That's not robbing anyone of their free will because they never existed in the first place. And the people that God does allow, let them be as close to the moral saints that have lived, like a Mother Teresa or a Gandhi or Martin Luther King, or a lot of these people are still flawed, but people maybe that aren't famous, but that maybe they don't always choose the good, but they choose it a lot more than Hitler. Seems like God has the knowledge, power, and motive to do that, but that's not the world we have. So that's the problem with the free will theodicy. So another theodicy for the problem of evil, another potential solution, is the contrast theodicy. This we talked about when we covered Zoroastrianism, and even if I didn't cover it, it's the idea that good or evil is necessary to exist if there's going to be good. So you can't have one without the other. So goodness is very much like tallness, or like the concept of grandparenthood. You can't have tallness without shortness. Similarly, you can't have good without evil. You can't have good without some suffering. You can't have grandparents unless they're grandchildren. If you magically erase the existence of grandchildren from the history from our timeline, that would also destroy all grandparents if you got rid of all the grandchildren. So these are relational concepts, and good and evil might be concepts like that. So if we were to interview God, why did you allow all the suffering? God might say, well, I could have created a world without suffering, without world without evil, but that would rob the world of all the good. Now the reply to that is, well, fine. Admittedly, that would entail that we need some suffering or some evil. So now my problem isn't so much with the mere existence of evil, but with the sheer quantity of it. Yes, we need some evil or suffering in the world to contrast the good, but why don't we just have less? It seems like we have an amount that is much, much too great, and that God could have created a world where there's much less suffering, and we still would be able to appreciate the good.